Darius took his daughter to the beach because it was free and because the bills at home were louder than the waves. Layla laughed near the water while he watched the sand slip through his fingers, counting what he couldn't afford to lose. Then he saw her. Barefoot, calm, unmistakable, his boss. In that moment, the ocean didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a test. She stopped, looked at his daughter, looked at him, and then she said 7 words. Words that would either end his career or expose a truth he'd been forced to carry in silence. What do you do when power finds you at your weakest? Drop a comment and tell us what you think those 7 words were. Subscribe now. This story doesn't let go once it starts. Darius Coleman's life ran on quiet routines and constant pressure. Mornings started before sunrise, not because he wanted them to, but because responsibility didn't wait. Layla Coleman moved through the apartment like a small reminder of why he kept going. Careful, observant, learning too early how to stay out of the way. The walls still carried traces of Naomi Coleman, the life they had planned and lost, the promise he carried alone now. Work was survival, not ambition. At Maxwell Creative Group, Darius showed up, delivered results, and disappeared again. Meetings passed without his voice. Ideas landed without his name. He had learned that being noticed in the wrong way could cost more than being ignored. The tension was always there. Layoffs whispered about, leadership watching closely, mistakes remembered longer when they came from people like him. The beach wasn't a luxury. It was an escape that didn't ask for money. A place where Layla could laugh without asking permission, and where Darius could pretend, just for an afternoon, that the weight on his chest wasn't permanent. That was the plan. Simple. Temporary. He didn't plan on recognition. When he realized the woman walking near the water was Evelyn Harper, the rules he lived by collapsed all at once. At work, she was distant and precise. Here, she was just another person. Until she wasn't. The power she carried didn't disappear with the sand between her toes. Darius felt it immediately. The danger of being seen. The risk of existing outside the role he was allowed to play. Nothing had happened yet. But something had already shifted, and whatever came next wouldn't stay quiet for long. The calm of the beach didn't survive the drive home. It never did. By the next morning, Darius felt the familiar tightening in his chest as soon as he walked into the building. At work, silence wasn't neutral. It was a warning. Eyes lingered too long. Conversation stopped too quickly. The same ideas he had shared weeks earlier now resurfaced with different voices attached to them, and no one bothered to look in his direction when praise followed. The pressure wasn't loud yet, but it was deliberate. He could feel the system leaning closer, measuring him, deciding how much weight he could carry before he broke. At Maxwell Creative Group, survival meant staying small, even when your work filled a room. Especially then. That afternoon, an email landed without warmth or explanation. Mandatory review. No context, no reassurance, just timing that felt intentional. As he stared at the screen, a voice cut through the office, sharp enough to turn heads. Don't get comfortable. People like you don't last here. The words weren't meant to be private. They weren't meant to be subtle. They were meant to remind him of his place. Darius didn't respond. He never did. Reaction was currency, and he had learned how expensive it could be. That night, the phone rang just after midnight. Layla's breathing was wrong. Too fast. Too shallow. Panic erased exhaustion. The hospital lights were harsh, unforgiving, bringing back memories he kept locked away. Naomi's absence pressed in on him as machines beeped steadily, each sound tightening the knot in his chest. The doctor finally stepped in, voice controlled, eyes already moving toward the chart. Dr. Colt. Richard Miller spoke with efficiency, not cruelty, but not with comfort either. This is serious, and you should have brought her in sooner. Guilt hit harder than fear. Darius stood frozen, absorbing the implication. Responsibility always found him first. Blame followed close behind. As Layla slept, small and fragile against white sheets, the weight of everything he couldn't protect her from settled heavily on his shoulders. He didn't notice Evelyn at first. She stood just inside the doorway, coat still on, expression unreadable. Not the executive version of her. Something quieter, something heavier. She watched the room, the machines, the way Darius held himself together through force alone. When she finally spoke, it wasn't soft. No one should have to carry all of this alone. The words cut through him, not because they were kind, but because they were accurate. He didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. Vulnerability had never been rewarded in his world. The following days blurred into tension. At work, meetings felt staged. At home, sleep came in fragments. Layla improved slowly, but the fear didn't leave with the fever. Darius knew the pattern well enough to recognize what was coming. Visibility always came with consequences. When the meeting finally happened, it wasn't framed as punishment. It never was. Calm voices, neutral language. The room arranged to feel reasonable. He listened as decisions were discussed about him, without him. His work, his future, his limits. Something inside him snapped, not loudly, not yet, just enough to push him forward when it mattered. ID, the work and you know it. The room stilled. That wasn't the response they expected. Across the table, Evelyn didn't interrupt. She watched. Let the moment stretch. Let discomfort do its job. Darius could feel the anger rising now. Not reckless, but controlled. The kind that demanded an ending. The meeting didn't resolve anything. Not yet. But as he walked out, heart pounding, one truth followed him relentlessly. This wasn't just about credit. It wasn't just about survival. It was about who was allowed to be seen and who was expected to disappear when power decided it was inconvenient. And whatever was coming next would not stay quiet. The room was designed to feel neutral. Glass walls, soft lighting, chairs spaced just far enough apart to discourage confrontation. But nothing about the moment was neutral. Darius could feel it in his chest before anyone spoke. The tightening, the quiet signal that this wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict waiting to be delivered. He sat still while papers were slid across the table. Charts, performance summaries, carefully selected language that sounded professional, but carried the same message he'd heard his whole life: know your place. The people around him avoided his eyes, not out of guilt, but habit. Silence had always done their work for them. Evelyn stood at the far end of the room, unreadable. Not intervening, not rescuing, watching. The pressure mounted as explanations stacked on top of each other. Why credit had gone elsewhere, why recognition had been delayed, why now wasn't the right time. Every excuse landed like another reminder that effort didn't guarantee fairness, especially not for him. Then the line was crossed. This is how it works. You should be grateful you're even here. The words rang out louder than intended, sharp enough to crack the calm they tried so hard to maintain. Darius felt heat rise behind his eyes. Not wild, not reckless, but focused. The kind of anger that comes from being pushed past endurance. He stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to make the room shift. I'm done pretending I didn't earn this. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. For the first time, no one rushed to smooth things over. No one redirected the conversation. The discomfort lingered, and with it, the truth they'd been avoiding. Evelyn finally moved. She stepped forward, placing a single folder on the table. Thicker than the others, deliberate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every campaign you praised, his hands built it. The air changed instantly. Pages flipped. Eyes scanned faster now, urgency replacing confidence. The system that had relied on Darius staying quiet was suddenly exposed to light it hadn't planned for. Metrics didn't lie. Timelines didn't bend. What had been dismissed as coincidence, aligned too cleanly to ignore. Darius watched it happen. The exact moment control slipped, not because someone felt sorry for him, but because denial had finally become impossible. One voice tried to reclaim authority, louder now, sharper, desperate to close the door before it opened any further. You're making a mistake. This isn't how things get done. That was the breaking point. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't explain. She looked directly at Darius, then back at the room. This is how it ends. No one interrupted after that. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It stood on its own, undeniable and exposed. Darius felt the weight he carried for years, loosen, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally been acknowledged. He wasn't asking for approval. He was reclaiming visibility. The decision came quickly after that. Too quickly. The kind of speed that only appears when damage control replaces arrogance. But Darius didn't feel relief yet, only clarity. As the meeting adjourned, he remained standing, heart pounding, fully aware that this moment would follow him. Whatever came next. Hope was dangerous. He knew that better than anyone. But so was silence. And this time, silence had lost. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed down the hall. not an ending, a reckoning. Darius Coleman didn't walk out of that building feeling victorious. There was no applause, no sudden sense of safety. What he felt instead was something heavier and more permanent. The truth had finally been spoken out loud, and once that happened, there was no returning to the version of himself that survived by staying invisible. At Maxwell Creative Group, the shift was immediate but uncomfortable. Credits were corrected. Roles were redefined. The system didn't apologize. It adjusted. That mattered. Not because it healed the damage, but because it confirmed what Darius had always known. The problem was never his work. It was the silence wrapped around it. At home, Layla Coleman noticed the change before anyone else. Not in words, but in posture. And how her father stood. And how he listened. And how the weight he carried no longer bent him forward. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled the room. The promise he made to Naomi Coleman years ago, in a hospital filled with machines and regret, had finally caught up with the present. He hadn't just survived. He had protected something more important than stability. He had protected truth. Evelyn Harper didn't become a hero. She became accountable. And that distinction mattered. Power didn't redeem itself. It revealed where it stood when silence stopped being convenient. What she chose to do didn't erase the harm, but it interrupted a pattern that depended on people like Darius believing resistance was pointless. Even the hospital follow-up felt different. When Dr. Richard Miller spoke this time, there was no assumption in his tone, only facts. Respect shouldn't feel surprising, but for too many, it still does. This story didn't end cleanly. Racism rarely does. It adapts. It waits. It counts on exhaustion. But something had changed that couldn't be undone. Because once people are seen clearly, unfiltered by fear, they don't disappear the same way again. The real question isn't whether injustice exists. It's how many people are still being asked to carry it quietly, and how much longer the world will pretend not to hear them. If this story hit close to home, don't let it stop here. Like the video so more people are forced to see it. Share it with someone who still thinks this doesn't happen. Drop a comment. Your voice matters more than you think. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles, where stories aren't softened, silenced, or ignored.